In 1819, there was beginning in 1819, there was this time of economic and political crisis. Now, the Panic of 1819 resulted primarily from reckless bank practices, including questionable loans and an overall decrease in U.S. exports to other countries. Now, the directors of the Second Bank of the United States had tightened credit to their branch banks the year earlier in 1818. And as a result of that, the branch banks, the banks out in various states and communities, were forced to call in the loans from the individuals in the country. Now, remember, the exports are down, which means people are selling less product, whatever the product is, the raw good or the finished good. Now, when these local banks call in the loans from the various individuals, they have no way to repay this loan. So the effects of this really revealed the chain of indebtedness throughout the nation. Factory owners had to lay off workers, merchants reduced the amount of orders they could put in for, and then businesses and individuals both faced bankruptcy. So this is a really difficult time for people in urban areas who are doing a lot of the day-to-day labor. But cotton farmers were hit especially hard during the panic, and many of these cotton farmers lost their land to the banks. Now, this seems like the banks kind of benefit, and they do to an extent, but the banks don't really need or want the land. What they want is the actual money to pay their own loans and to keep their banks afloat. When the state banks failed, the Bank of the United States was left holding massive mortgages on lands in the West. As Congress, manufacturers, and ordinary Americans debated how to combat the effects of the panic, the working men, small farmers, and frontier settlers suspected that the concerns of the merchants, the bankers, the planters, and the manufacturers were of greater concern to politicians than the concerns and needs of the working class people, the poor people in the country. The panic was over by 1823, but it left Americans very distrustful of the banks and of federal authority. What they believed was that the banks and big government really didn't care about most people. Now, Missouri applied for statehood in 1819. So at the same time that this crisis, this economic crisis is taking place, Missouri applies for statehood. And Congressman James Talmadge Jr. proposed that Missouri be admitted to the Union and that it hinge on gradual emancipation and a ban on future imports of slaves. Now, obviously, Southerners were very concerned by this because another state that did not allow slavery would sort of tip the balance against Southerners. So Southern politicians, of course, trying to keep this balance of power between free states and slave states, had to find some type of way around this issue. Northerners had the majority in the House of Representatives. So the Southern senators actually blocked Maine's admission as a free state at the time. So we have two states seeking to come into the Union. Southerners equated slavery's expansion with slavery's future and worried that the divisions among whites over slavery would encourage more and more slave rebellion. Now, Henry Clay, and I mentioned him in the earlier part of chapter 9, Henry Clay is a representative and he creates this proposal, this compromise, which would bring Maine into the country and it would be a free state. And it would bring Missouri into the country as a slave state. And then there would also be this boundary established at the 3630 parallel. And in short, this line, and I'm going to go ahead and switch over and show you the line. This line here in the center would ultimately be the division between free states and slave states. Now, the Missouri Compromise, as this is known, calmed the tensions for the moment, but debates that preceded it and then the concerns that followed it really revealed how quickly the nation could become very divided over the issue of slavery. Now, just to make sure you're making some notes here, we have, this territory here, which was the original um, part of the country, and then we continue to inch into this western territory. And you can see that there's a pretty clear division between the areas that are slave states, more agrarian, and the areas that are free states that are more urban. Now, I want to make sure that I continue to remind you that even though these states are considered free states, there are people in those in some of those individual states that do continue to have slaves through the duration of the Civil War. So this is a very important distinction because we are at the time very concerned about allowing individual states and even local municipalities giving them the opportunity to decide how best to govern themselves. While few people voted in presidential elections during this time, state and local political events drew large crowds that even included female participants. Now, this is very important. Many people were less concerned about the presidential elections and the federal government. What they were concerned about was who would be managing their states and their towns because they wanted to exert their own voice and influence in those local elections. Now, the Panic of 1819 convinced many laboring men to demand suffrage as a way to get politicians to respond to their concerns. At this particular point in our nation's history, men without property can vote in some areas, but the majority of states do not allow that. Some politicians, like Martin Van Buren, who was a Democratic Republican, fought for universal white male suffrage, but others, including Daniel Webster, argued that suffrage should be based on property qualifications. By the end of the 1920s, most Atlantic seaboard states had lowered or eliminated the property qualifications, joining the western states that had allowed universal white male suffrage since their founding. The expansion of the electorate did not extend to all non-white males, nor did it extend to females. And women and African American males even lost their voting rights in the northern areas where they had enjoyed them before universal male suffrage. Keep in mind that universal means national, and so national law will supersede state or local law. Proponents of African American disfranchisement justified it with racial arguments, and those arguments won out. Congress joined northern and southern state legislatures in passing legislation that limited African American rights. Whites used violence to terrorize blacks in order to keep the racial power structure in place. Denmark Vesey, a free slave living in Charleston, was accused of plotting to free the city's slaves. He and 34 other men were hanged after being found guilty, despite lack of clear evidence. Mob violence against African Americans occurred in northern cities as well, driving some free blacks northward into Canada. So we're starting to see the 1820s are a time of increase in violence towards African Americans and a decrease in some of the rights and freedoms that African Americans and women enjoyed in the first 100 years of the nation's history. Now, Federalists had once fought for Black rights. Recall, the Federalists are the advocates of big government, big central government. By the 1920s, they had declined in power, and the Democratic Republicans did not pick up this fight. Democratic Republicans became divided over the issue of federal authority and how strictly to interpret the Constitution. Younger politicians like Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson favored limited federal government. In 1824, the Democratic Republicans split into two parties, the Democrats and the National Republicans. The Democratic Republican Congress and the Democratic Republican Congressional Caucus also fractured into four camps, each with their own nominee for president. Now, what's important to make a note of in your mind here is that the older Democratic Republicans like Thomas Jefferson favored a stronger federal government, but the younger generation wanted a weaker federal government or a stronger state government. But at the same time, we're starting to see that division reflected in Congress as well. And remember, we have become very divided as a nation in terms of region or geography. That will also play into this particular conflict. So each of these camps at the caucus had their own preferred candidate for presidency. Those four candidates were John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and Andrew Jackson. Now, Adams favored tariffs and internal improvements. Jackson advocated for limiting federal power, and these two were the most popular. They were ultimately the frontrunners for this particular campaign. Jackson appealed to the small farmers and the laborers, and he portrayed himself as a man of the people, a working man. Jackson ultimately won the popular vote. He had the support of the majority of the people who voted. No candidate in this particular election of 1824 actually had an electoral majority. And as a result of this, the vote is sent to the House of Representatives. Now, Henry Clay, who had been a senator, encouraged his supporters to back Adams because he was more in line with the thinking of Henry Clay. As a result of this, Adams wins the election. Jackson accused Adams and Clay of making what he called a corrupt bargain when Clay became Adams' Secretary of State. Now, Adams was unable to implement his agenda due to Van Buren blocking him in Congress and John Calhoun, who was his Southern vice president, opposing all of his policies. Adams was able to pass a tariff on raw materials in 1828 due to Jackson and Van Buren's support. They believed that the tariff would benefit the frontier farmers. The tariff was the only substantial legislative accomplishment. And as the 1828 election is approaching, Adams is appearing to be a very weak and ineffectual leader, and Jackson's popularity and support is growing. Now, Jackson really sees what has taken place in 1824, and he decides that he wants to actually run for president. And so what he means by that is that he wants to really coordinate a effective campaign because more people are voting now. And so people are not just voting on names and kind of the previous president's uh, recommendation, but they're actually getting a little more engaged in politics. So Jackson and Adams ran against each other in 1828, and they really used these new techniques to appeal to the electorate. Some of the things that they use are actual campaigns and speeches and meet and greet tours. Van Buren organized a national campaign for Jackson that would appeal to a wide group of Americans. Now, he was helped by John C. Calhoun, who was running as Jackson's vice president. Now, remember, he's actually Adams' vice president at the time, but he's running as Jackson's vice president. Now, Jackson toured the nation during this campaign, and he worked to rally support from different groups, and he was a bit vague. He made some conflicting promises. He was very much a politician. He, shakes hands and he drinks shots of whiskey and he kisses babies and he's very cordial with the ladies. He does everything that a politician should do. Now, Adams supporters actually launched very personal attacks on Andrew Jackson and his wife, Rachel, and accused Rachel not only of adultery, but also of bigamy. Jackson appealed to the electorate and carried all regions except for New England. The election marked the official split of the Democrats and the National Republicans and also introduced the future of campaigning in the United States. Now, if you look at this chart, what you can see are the election results from 1828 and 1824. Now, if you're looking at 1824, you'll see again that Jackson, although he did receive the popular vote, he does not receive, no candidate receives the electoral vote. William Crawford was something of, he wasn't super important in that he was relatively unknown, and he very quickly cast his support behind John Quincy Adams, as does Henry Clay, who came in, very low here. By 1828, we are really at a two-party candidacies, and we can see that in 1828, Jackson not only has the majority of the popular vote at 56%, he also has the majority of the electoral vote. So over the course of 4 years, and with a very spirited boots on the ground type of political campaign, Jackson is able to secure the election. Jackson's inauguration was attended by very large crowds, very boisterous crowds of supporters, and they came from all different backgrounds. The crowd continued its rowdy celebration of the day's festivities into the White House, and it was something almost of a frat party. There was a lot of alcohol consumption. There was a lot of rowdiness. It was a wild time in the White House. While Jackson's supporters viewed such celebrations as symbolic expansions of democracy through an increased electorate, others viewed it as unruliness and dangerous. Now, this had never happened in the past to this level, not because people were not excited, but because the people who were actually participating in these events were primarily upper class people. Jackson's controversial choice of John Eaton as his Secretary of War marked another split between Jackson and the traditional leaders. Eaton's wife drew the ire of Washington wives, and Eaton was eventually forced out of office in what became known as the Petticoat Affair. Now, she was an interesting lady, but the wives of these other men in Washington were really something of the mean girls, if you will. They were they did not like her, and they were very adamant about making their disdain of her known. They would plan to have, lunch or tea, and they would intentionally exclude her from those events. They were just really awful. And so this ultimately becomes known as the Petticoat Affair. Eventually, Eaton leaves Washington. Now, his resignation was followed by the resignations of Jackson's entire cabinet. Jackson, as a result, came to rely on informal advisors, his so-called kitchen cabinet. And Jackson implemented a spoils system in which he would give federal appointments to his most loyal supporters. Jackson drew support from different groups with competing interests, but his vetoes of internal improvement bills fractured that support, pleasing some and angering others. Southern agriculture was suffering due to soil exhaustion and because of the 1828 Tariff of Abominations, which Southerners had hoped Jackson would reduce. Jackson and his vice president, Calhoun, disagreed on the concept of nullification, which Calhoun advocated as an assertion of states' rights in light of the tariff. Now, nullification is a big word that means that if a state does not like a federal law, or they believe that a federal law is harmful to that state, then the state legislature can vote to nullify that federal law. Northerners were opposed to nullification, and Southerners supported it. Jackson lost a lot of Southern support because he actually did oppose nullification. He had become something of a strong federal or central government advocate once he became president. After Jackson signed into law an 1832 tariff passed by Northern and Western congressmen, South Carolinians approved an ordinance of nullification and threatened secession. Let's make sure we have that again. After Jackson signed into law an 1832 tariff, which was passed by Northern and Western congressmen, Folks in South Carolina immediately approved an ordinance of nullification to reject this law, and they threatened to secede from the Union. The tariff issue and the renewal of the Bank of the United States Charter became the defining issues of the 1832 election campaign. With the hope of dividing the Democratic Party before 1832, Jackson's opponents pushed for an early renewal of the Bank of the United States. Now, the tight money policies of the Bank of the United States earned support from Northern merchants, bankers, and entrepreneurs, as well as the Southern planters, again, the wealthiest people. But most Americans disliked the bank and were not trustful of the bank. Congress approved the charter renewal and Jackson vetoed it. But rather than dividing the Democratic Party, his veto served to rally his supporters and helped him to win re-election. In 1832, Jackson secured the passage of a force bill, which authorized him to use the military, to enforce national laws in South Carolina. To avoid military conflict over nullification, though, Jackson worked to reduce the tariff. Now, again, this is 1832 and 1833. South Carolina says, hey, we don't like this law. We're going to ignore it or we're going to leave the nation. And Jackson, who is a Southern president, says, oh, well, I don't care if you don't like the law, it's the law. But then he tries to find a way to work with Southerners. Now that's some foreshadowing to what we'll see take place in 1860 and in 1861. Jackson's an interesting president. Some people are very fond of Jackson, some people are not. But here we see this idea that Jackson, here with the wild and red hair, is ultimately fighting many different monsters, many different entities that are all connected to the same monster or the same beast. Jackson supported removing Indian tribes from their lands to gain the land for white settlers. He opposed Indian sovereignty, even for tribes that had assimilated. Southern states demanded federal assistance to remove Indians from their lands. The Cherokee Nation declared itself sovereign, but Jackson and the state of Georgia did not recognize this sovereignty. The Cherokees opposed the Indian Removal Act, which sought to remove Indians from their lands. Jackson used the military to force the Indians to be removed. Some tribes fought back on the battlefield. The Cherokee, led by John Ross, fought for removal through the court system. Ultimately, however, natives were removed from their native lands into the Western Territories. Now, here we see an image of an auction at Chatham Square. And in the image, what we can see is that these people, most likely lower middle class and working people, had not been able to repay their loans. And so likely the banker has come in and they have seized this property to be sold at auction to recoup as much money as could be recouped. Here we can see a lot of dishes on the floor. There are some children in this family. And so we're really being introduced to the reality that at this particular time, during this economic crisis, many people are losing not just their homes, but in some cases their most basic household items. And that brings us to the end of chapter 9.